It's part of a general multicultural project which has been underway since at least the new Labour government, and the rebuilding of British identity. And I guess the authentic history of our people is collateral damage in the march towards this utopian vision of the future for Britain.
One British thought leaders, Tom Rowsell, talks about the importance of our history and battling activist attempts to rewrite it.
There have been many empires in history. Probably none of them were as benevolent as the British Empire. It's one of the least cruel empires ever to exist, and it definitely, inarguably brought benefits to many of the people it conquered. But this is not very flattering for people, so this kind of historical facts are sort of brushed aside, and the focus is on atrocities, and of course this also entails demands for reparations.
Tom talks about the establishment of England, key historical figures, and the role of religion.
Because of the horrors of this English Civil War and a desire to sort of prevent similar religious turmoil, we have arrived at a secular ideology that others have copied subsequently, which allows people to keep their religious life private, and it doesn't interfere with public life so much, which was quite an agreeable arrangement until people started abusing it.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with historian and YouTuber Tom Rowsell. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Lee.
So your YouTube channel, Survive the Jive, is very successful. You've got over 250,000 subscribers. You talk a bit about the mission of the channel and why it's important for modern people to understand their history.
Well, I believe that history is a way for people to understand themselves in the scope of history, of the past and the future. Our understanding of the future is only a projection of what we understand about the past. And our understanding of ourselves is only based on the amalgamation of everything we know about what's come before. So no man is an island. We're all part of a collective groups, and we're also part of a chain linking us to the past and the future. So I think if you don't know history, then you're quite atomized. You're sort of a victim of sort of the gravity of history without understanding it. So you will be pulled along by historical forces without understanding what's happening. So it's essential for everyone to have some knowledge of history, particularly their own history.
What kind of stuff are you covering on the channel to deal with this? Well,
I'm mostly focused on the history of Europe, and particularly Northern Europe, because that's where we live, and where I have an interest in it myself, coming from England, and Englishness as well. I began it focusing on Anglo-Saxons and English things. I did a master's degree in medieval history at UCL, where I mainly studied Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse sort of sources, so the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons mainly. But that was some years ago now, more than a decade ago. And since then I've become more interested also in things far deeper in the past. And new kinds of scientific methods have become available for us to understand the past, such as archaeogenetics, which is looking at the DNA in ancient skeletons to find out their relationship to different peoples at the time and even today, so we can say who descends from whom. So all these things sort of play into helping us understand the present. So I kind of go mainly from the Bronze Age, including Bronze Age Britain, all the way up to the medieval era, and that's kind of the area I focus on.
One thing I noticed with your videos, a lot of the time you go to all these places rather than just taking B-roll. It kind of makes it feel a bit more authentic, if you know.
Yeah, I find that a lot of the B-roll is not really accurate, because it's sort of, it's quite generic stuff. I use B-roll sometimes when I can find good B-roll, or I'm not able to go to where I want to go. But some of the artifacts, I think, really nice to talk about them, because they are the subject of, and I'm not an archaeologist, but I'm really interested in archaeology. And the study of history is all about trying to interpret what historians have said in the past and build up a narrative and discern the truth through it. Whereas archaeology, you have a far more honest source. In fact, it's 100% honest source, but it still requires interpretation. And sometimes it's just a marvel to behold, whether it's an ancient temple or just a tiny little artifact that's been dug out the soil in England. And that really brings history alive in a very authentic way. So I try to let artifacts and things like that speak for themselves rather than just have generic shots of people in costumes running around.
We've seen quite a few attempts in recent years to rewrite history. I mean, one example is this BBC programme that suggested the earliest settlers of England were not ethnically white. You made a video debunking this. I mean, why is this happening? What do you think the goal is of rewriting our history?
Well, there are many different people involved in this, and sometimes they might have what they perceive to be noble goals, which is, for example, the people who were twisting the ideas of Mesolithic Europeans to say that they would use the term black, although they knew full well when they said that they didn't think that the Mesolithic Europeans, such as Cheddar Man, were related to the people we now term black in terms of legal British law, what we would say about a black person legally or politically when we're talking about representation of black people. We're referring specifically to an actual group of people from sub-Saharan Africa. They knew full well that these are not sub-Saharan Africans or in any way related to them, but they wanted to kind of integrate this terminology into the past of Britain as a way to make people of Afro-Caribbean descent in Britain feel more welcome and part of our history, and they probably consider that a noble lie in that respect. One of the individuals responsible working with the Natural History Museum had another paper where he specifically said that it was important after Brexit to prevent narratives of the past feeding into nationalistic narratives that would lead to things like Brexit. But at the same time, he was very delighted to find out that the black people in modern Britain were identifying with Cheddar Man after his work. So he's contradictory there. He wants to prevent natives of Britain from identifying with the past while encouraging non-natives to identify with our past. And it's part of a general multicultural project which has been underway since at least the new Labour government and the rebuilding of British identity. And I guess the authentic history of our people is collateral damage in the march towards this utopian vision of the future for Britain.
It's quite strange, that clash between wanting to celebrate history but not wanting to celebrate nationalism. I mean, there's nothing wrong with nationalism, is there?
I don't think so. I don't think the being proud of your past has any problem. I mean, every nation has things that are, morally questionable in the past, and every individual probably has as well. But that you should still be proud of yourself and proud of your people. It doesn't mean that you need to denigrate other peoples. It doesn't mean that you are. There's kind of an assumption, I guess, since the mid-20th century that any kind of nationalism in Europe will inevitably lead to Auschwitz. There's a sort of unpreventable domino effect. As soon as people aren't ashamed of themselves, then an atrocity will occur. But that's really completely irrational. It's just not borne out by any evidence at all.
I mean, we see this if we think about Japan, say. I mean, they embrace modernity, but at the same time, they celebrate the decades and centuries of history and culture as part of their national character. But it seems with the English, it's kind of a bit frowned upon to do that. I mean, why do you think there's the difference?
Well, it's I think it's partly been, Orwell noted this even in his time, that the chattering classes found it, they were very delighted in denigrating England, and maybe it's part of our national character that for educated people quite to distinguish themselves from the rabble by not being proud or being by it's fashionable to be denigrating of our past, but it certainly wasn't the case so much in the 19th century. I think it's something that occurred sometime in the 20th century, but the early 20th century, and it's got worse and worse. But then, certainly with also the dominance in academia and in politics and media for people to accept a narrative of history where our colonial past is seen as a great evil, and alongside the other great evils of the past is like it was already the Nazis and the American slave trade, and now they're sort of adding to that the British Empire is one of these other things, and so anything to do with the British Empire is so awful that it needs to have a little note next to it in the museum, or even a National Trust property if the owner of the house is granny's auntie may have got some money from slavery, then the whole thing needs to be labelled for context. But this is sort of an obsessive cult almost that I think will wear out at some point. There are many empires. There have been many empires in history. Probably none of them were as benevolent as the British Empire. It's one of the least cruel empires ever to exist, and it definitely, inarguably, brought benefits to many of the people it conquered, or it didn't even necessarily need to conquer many of the people it ruled militarily because they were welcomed in some cases. But this is not very flattering for people. So this kind of like historical facts are sort of brushed aside, and the focus is on atrocities, and of course this also entails demands for reparations, and there's a lot of money to be made from the grievance industry, and historians play a part in supporting these narratives that the British have been so evil, the British are bad, with the absurd extreme examples now leading into things like the Elgin marbles here in London being somehow stolen, which is completely unsupported by evidence, but it's nothing to do with colonialism. In fact, it was taken from a colonial force, the Ottomans, a violent colonial power in the region, who we rescued them from. So it's just becoming ridiculous. But yeah, I think these various things have fed towards the state we're now in.
You're obviously an historian, but looking forward, if we allow these decolonisation forces or racial politics forces, whatever, to actually change our history, and we didn't do anything about it like you are, what do you think the consequences would be? Where would we end up?
Well, I suppose something along the lines of South Africa is quite likely, where, if the oppression of a certain group is seen as politically justified because of certain historical grievances, and these can be supported by fake economic theories, fake history, fake anything, and anything going arguing against them is seen as morally bad because it argues against them. There's no longer any sort of room for factual analysis. It's like the lived experiences of the oppressed is the most important thing. There's not really any way to prevent a South African scenario where even the state can be, if not involved in, like tacitly supporting mass violence of a certain demographic because it's seen as like correcting historical injustices. And I think that there are people among our political class who think like that already, who kind of feel like, certain acts of violence or against the native population are okay because the perpetrators are themselves belonging to marginalized or oppressed groups historically, and that these kinds of disturbances are just a sort of redressing the balance of history.
Everything's kind of in this victim-oppressor narrative, and if you're the victim, then everything's fine. If you're the oppressor, then it's not. Yeah,
and you could argue that kind of way of thinking may have contributed towards the horrors of Rotherham and the other grooming gang scandals, possibly over 100 towns. I'm not sure how many are involved. It's all coming out now, and it's taken so long, I think, for this to come to light because certainly in the second decade of this millennium, it was very powerful. This narrative of like the victim is right, and you are an aggressor. You can inherit the status of aggressor by virtue of your being a native Englishman. Yeah. So and even if you're a child, therefore to some extent you are an oppressor. It's from a very extreme left-wing perspective, but it's just gradually crept up from the 1990s under the New Labour and got worse and worse even under the Tories. But I think, yes, in the last 5 years, it's started to maybe it's being challenged now, and I think enough people are fed up really and seeing it for what it is, which is not the virtuous ideology it sort of purports to be, but rather quite a deranged worldview.
I wanted to ask you a bit about this term Anglo-Saxon. This situation happened that seemed kind of bizarre to me. There were attempts to ban the term Anglo-Saxon. You were part of the opposition. You took quite a lot of personal abuse because of this. And can you give us an overview of what happened and why were people trying to ban that term?
Well, briefly, there was always a kind of question about the Anglo-Saxon migration before, when all we relied on were medieval sources who gave a pretty good description of it happening in the 5th century. In the 19th century, people were happy to trust those sources. They saw no reason to question them. But 20th century scholarship was a bit more, the sort of fashion is to be more critical of the sources. And so, especially in the later 20th century, people were like, to what extent really was it an invasion? And to what extent are the English really descended from these people? And these kind of questions were up in the air. But then in around 2019, it was no longer like just about questioning if, but actually saying from America that because the use of the word Anglo-Saxon from the 18th and 19th centuries within America was allegedly racist. Therefore, using Anglo-Saxon in any context, including in Britain, from medieval historians, was
where
racist.
The Anglo-Saxons were.
Yeah, well, in the homeland of the Anglo-Saxons, and it's not really ever had a racist connotation in England, even if it's true that it had one in Canada, which is and in America, where this sort of stuff was coming out of, Canada and the United States, where the academics started to try and make these claims to ban Anglo-Saxon and change it to say early medieval. But this was a small group of woke or left-wing, far-left academics, archaeologists and historians who just tried to make it impossible for people to talk about the Anglo-Saxons as an ethnicity that existed and formed in the 5th century and were later described by the Venerable Bede, but in the 700s. But around the same time they're doing this, big scientific papers were coming out that actually vindicated the claims of Bede in the 700s. Oh. So in 2016 there was a small one, and then in 2022 there was a much larger one which concluded verified the claims from 2016. So it was this attempt in 2019 to ban Anglo-Saxon was very much going against science, and also it was met with strong opposition initially only by me. I sort of rang the alarm bells in 2019, but before the end of the year, a lot of academics, mostly British academics, had signed a large petition to oppose this because they thought, and not just conservative academics, all across the political spectrum, people who were involved in history, linguistics, archaeology were saying this is ridiculous. Nevertheless, it had some effects in the real world in our country, with a couple of major universities actually changing the names of their courses to remove the word Anglo-Saxon. So they're happy with the words Celt and Viking, even though...
For now.
They said there was... In Cambridge they have Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic studies. The terms Celtic and Norse are far more problematic for students of history than Anglo-Saxon, because the Celtic-speaking peoples of Britain definitely never called themselves Celts. And the term Norse was really only used for Norwegians, and all the Vikings in England were actually Danes, so it doesn't actually work as a catch-all that well for the entire Scandinavian Viking phenomenon. But Anglo-Saxon is a term that Anglo-Saxons actually used for themselves, and it has always been a synonym for English, because actually the word English is attested before the word Anglo-Saxon, so it just meant us. It's really not that controversial to use, and some academics have tried to say, it wasn't used enough times to be a valid ethnonym, but this is very pedantic and also dishonest. They just wanted to have this victory of making it not possible to say the word Anglo-Saxon, and thereby cut a big wedge between the English people and their ethnogenesis in the 5th century.
Why did you lead the kind of defending of this term, and what kind of backlash did you face?
One of the reasons I decided to study Anglo-Saxons in the first place is because I understand that was the foundation of the English people. And also I felt that English people as a group have been under attack at least since the New Labour government. Jack Straw had said something along the lines that the English nation was, I'm paraphrasing, like uniquely violent and somehow problematic in a way that even the Scots and the Welsh aren't. And I find as an Englishman this was very offensive. And although all periods of English history are important for us, you know, the Tudors, Plantagenets, like even the British Empire, everything has its place in understanding the rich tapestry of our history. But the foundation is very special just because that's the start. And if we can understand that start, then we have a better sort of foundation on which to understand this full span of our some 1,500 years of history. So I focused on that. And then when I saw, and that in 2012, and then in 2019, when I saw that these far left academics were trying to attack that, I understood why. Because the people I'm talking about specifically are self-described Marxists, and they, you know, recommend quite extreme Marxist authors like Fanon and Margot Hendricks to students of medieval English history.
Right.
And these authors are nothing to do with history or medievalism. They're just American racial Marxists who focus on like the you know, racial inequality and this kind of thing in America. So it doesn't have any relevance to someone who's trying to understand what medieval England was like. So I understood what was happening and why they were doing it, and you know, it was an attack on Englishness from my perspective. So I wanted to, I did a stream initially just to sort of make more people aware and try to encourage them to oppose it. The backlash I received from some of the academics who were not involved initially, and some others as well who were all far left, they published a couple of peer-reviewed papers in which they tried to describe me as a white supremacist.
Really?
And because of the legal protections that peer-reviewed academic journals get, I wasn't able to take legal action because you can't sue for libel if it's protected. There's certain protections that peer review have.
Oh, right. A higher protection than the newspaper or something.
Yeah.
Right.
So, you know, they're not really required to
Tell the truth.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's not proper scholarship. They can just say that, and I've never said anything. I mean, supremacist is an actual English word. It has a meaning, a literal meaning, where you think one thing is supreme over another, or should be. And I've never said anything like that. So it's completely unsubstantiated. But they can get away with it, and then it can be referred to as an academic document because it's peer-reviewed. And this is not in a journal of medieval history, the study of medieval history. It's got nothing to do with it. It's a perversion of academia by political activists for political ends, which is the whole reason they wanted to ban Anglo-Saxon in the first place. But I keep on going at it, and I'm pretty sure they'll lose because the general public is perfectly happy to continue using the word Anglo-Saxon.
Do you think we're in a period of time now where people enter academic fields like yours not because they love the subject, but because they kind of want to subvert it?
Certainly, and I think the people I've been talking about are a good example of that. It's hard for me to understand the motivation, though. You know, studying any subject at degree level is a big time investment. It's part of your life, and it's probably going to it's going to influence the trajectory of your entire career. Some people, especially if you end up in academia, I think a lot of history academics sort of regret after a few years getting stuck into a subject they can't get out of because you specialize and then you're in it. So that can result in some resentful characters who then, you know, may express that resentment through their work.
All right, so maybe they loved it at the start, but they became bitter.
Yeah, or like they have maybe extreme left-wing politics because they can't earn very much money in academia, so they're trying to find a way to seek more rent. But in some cases, I think that they really, I find it hard to psychologically understand the motivation for someone whose main interest in life is for example, the plight of the African American, or the inequalities that African Americans have faced, to then study the early medieval history of England. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but there are some people like that. And I'm sure the same is true across the fields. I mean, even when I was at university, I remember some students who would only interested in analysing every single text from a feminist perspective, for example, and that's encouraged. Like, analyse this text from a Marxian perspective or from a Freudian perspective or something.
I studied English, and that's exactly how it works.
Yeah, it's actually, these are like, you're given different tools of critique with which to study a text in history or in all the humanities, even media studies and everything. So study this film, this book, this poem from the perspective of Marxist Freud or whatever. And, people then, the students who are less capable of arriving at independent lines of inquiry will naturally follow the provided sort of routes of inquiry that their professors would prefer. And as a result, they are, quite uniform in their conclusions.
So that's surely destroying academia in some sense, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think to some extent, yeah. Certainly, a lot of the people who are studying the humanities, I don't think they really contribute anything of value to human knowledge, and they probably would be better off not studying those things anyway. But there are still good academics out there. There are still people doing great work, and I'm totally supportive of higher education. I believe in it, and I think that the universities are great things, and part of European culture and heritage, that these wonderful institutions exist. So it's well worth reforming them and making sure that these kind of people don't distort the study of history or other subjects of the liberal arts.
So there's been a lot of talk in recent times about England. Where did England come from? Who are the English people? Whilst you're here, I was hoping we could get a bit of a kind of history lesson on this. I mean, where did England start, and what are the key events that shaped us into who we are?
Well, the Anglo-Saxon migration is definitely dated to the early 5th century. The historical texts that we look at from Britain that talk about it place it in 410 specifically, but I'm sure it wasn't so specifically that year. But we can tell the genetics have basically vindicated the claims of Bede and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Gildas that they were mainly 3 Germanic groups, ethnic tribes, dwelling in the southern part of the Jutland Peninsula and the North Germany, just near the mouth of the Elbe River, known as the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes or Utes, and they may have not all migrated for the same reasons. There's some question about this. There is a sort of probably apocryphal story from Gildas, the Welsh monk, saying that there was some kind of mercenary, Saxon mercenaries who were protecting the Britain. King Vortigern needed help after the Romans left. The fall of the late Roman Empire, there was a complete removal of, we know from archaeology and genetics, the Romans completely left, and there's no genetic signal of any Romans left in Britain.
Right.
And not only did the people leave, but a lot of the infrastructure and the economy was gone. The economy tanked. There was just no longer the levels of production, and it was a bit of a kind of end of days scenario. And the Picts on the other side of Hadrian's Wall took advantage of this and started raiding, according to this medieval narrative. And as a result, the Britons called on Saxon mercenaries to come. And this is quite likely because the Angles and Saxons had a long tradition of several centuries now of serving as mercenaries in the Roman army. So they were well familiar. They would have had elites who were familiar with Britain, had been to Britain, had lived in Britain, working as in the Roman army, and probably could have been called back again. The Britons themselves, having been Romanized, would think of, by late Roman times, a significant portion of the Roman military was of Germanic origin. So the Britons would have been used to calling on Germans as a military force, but they apparently overstayed their welcome. And it's also possible that the Jutes specifically may have had a push factor to come here as refugees rather than mercenaries, because there is some evidence of climatic problems in the region that would have created some difficulties for them. So there must have been a coordinated effort between these 3 groups, because they all came at the same time, seemed to settle in a very organized way. The exact details of this we'll never truly know, but it does seem it was not a sporadic sort of trickle of people coming randomly, but a wholesale migration of people that really wasn't possible in earlier periods of history. This was a controlled and planned settlement, somewhat akin to the settlement of America by the English later on. And yes, within initially genetic and skeletal evidence shows there was an 80% population replacement of the eastern side of the island,
Wow.
followed by gradual mixing with the natives to create the modern English type of person. And we're sort of in the region of, depending on where you are, somewhere about 40% from the Germanic incomers and 60% from the previous inhabitants.
So did people who were already here kind of go west when those people all arrived?
Most of them seem to mix together.
Okay.
So actually, in this part of the country, people are about 50-50 here in the east of the country, because London's quite far east. So, but as you go further west, like to Somerset, they're about 40%. I think when I said 40% to 60%, that's actually a national average by region. But since most people live down here, it's more like half and half. So there was obviously a big mixing. But a certain amount of Britons who didn't like the English would have just moved to Wales and Cornwall and become the Welsh and the Cornish. Right. And some of them who really hated them actually migrated to France and became the Bretons of Brittany. Right. And that's why it has the name Brittany, after the British people who migrated at that time.
All right.
Yeah. That was in the 5th century, as I say, and then within a couple of hundred years, a sort of coherent English identity emerges. It's first described by the Venerable Bede and later ratified as the foundation of the English nation, beginning with the expansion of the Kingdom of Wessex under Alfred and later solidified by his grandson.
Can we just do another mild detour? You've mentioned Bede several times. Who was Bede? Why was he important?
Bede was a monk from Northumbria, and he was highly literate, which was not common for the time. Even the kings would have been illiterate at that stage. So, and he was interested in writing down a coherent history of the English people, which is called Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, which means the ecclesiastical history of the English people. And this was important because up north, in the north of England, in Northumbria, the Angles were Christianized by Irish missionaries, and the south here was Christianized by the Gregorian mission from Pope Gregory. But he wanted to make it clear that the English, the Angles and Saxons, formed one coherent ethnic group in opposition to the Celtic-speaking Christians. So he simultaneously wanted to define them as a Christian group, but also not as a Celtic one, not being the same as the Gaels who had the Gaelic missionaries who had converted his people to Christianity, because there was a slight disagreement on certain theological matters and ecclesiastical matters, like the dating of Easter between the Irish Church and the Roman Church at that time. And the English had been, they conformed to the norms of Rome, and so he wanted to make sure that was clear. And also, they didn't really always get on so well, the Celtic-speaking inhabitants of Britain and the Germanic ones, even to the extent that the Celtic-speaking Christians in Britain sometimes collaborated with the English pagans to fight against English Christians. So it wasn't so much a case of just Christians versus pagans, or even of Celtic speakers versus English speakers, but there was a complicated sort of conflicts. But yes, Bede is essential for the formation of our nation, although it would have pre-existed for him to be able to describe it. But putting down into writing the history of our people and how we came to be, and explaining how we form a coherent ethnic group so early on in our history is essential for understanding who we are.
So that's kind of 1,200 years ago.
Yeah, it's really long. And that makes us one of the most well-attested ethnic groups on earth. So for us, anyone to deny the English are an ethnic group, they have rather a difficult argument to make.
So what happened after Bede? What was the next?
Yeah, as I say, Alfred the Great was essential, although he didn't really form the English nation state. By expanding his Kingdom of Wessex, he began the process whereby it became possible for England to become a coherent nation state under his grandson. And also things like the Viking invasions, which Alfred himself was fighting, that actually gave us a coherent enemy, and that's always a good way of uniting an ethnic group, is feeling itself to be one, instead of like many kingdoms which had previously existed, of Saxon kingdoms like Wessex and Anglian kingdoms in Northumbria or whatever. Suddenly, like a more coherent sense of we're all the same, we're fighting against these invaders, and that was a very coherent identity by the time of 1066, when the Norman conquest occurred. To the extent that even after the Normans won, the word English, the ethnonym of English, remained and was used by the French to describe us, and even eventually by the Norman lords adopted it to describe themselves.
So, King Alfred, Churchill said he's the greatest Englishman that ever lived. I think he's the only monarch that has the Great as part of his official name. What did he do that made him so great?
Well, he set up a system of fortifications which is like enabled a centralization of planning to, which didn't previously exist, which allowed for a faster response time to Viking incursions. And he was himself literate, which, as I said previously, was not common for any European kings at the time. So he was unusual, very well read, very intellectual type of king. And that might seem normal from now looking at kings and we think about more recent history, but it certainly wasn't then. Kings were essentially warlords at the time in most of Europe, whether they were Christian or pagan. But he had a completely different sort of attitude, and he was quite clever about the way he organized England against the Vikings and helped to expand the kingdom of Wessex and begin the process that allowed England to become a nation state. And promoted the idea of understanding our history and understanding and reading and things like that. Asser wrote a biography of him, and I think he was involved in the translation of the Bible into Old English, which is later, of course, a big question in Europe, much later during the time of Luther, about whether the Bible ought to be written in vernacular languages. But obviously that kind of process was already underway in England very early. But he's certainly a special king for the time. That kind of king was not probably seen earlier on. And of course, he celebrated I went to a King Alfred school in Wantage at one stage. There's a lovely statue of him there, and there's two great statues in this country of him. Those are two of them. I think there's some other less great statues of him, but there's not enough. I believe that he should be put on the fourth plinth at Trafalgar Square. I mean, or maybe they could have one of him here in Westminster, get rid of some of the unnecessary statues that I don't think ought to be there.
Is he on top of the Royal Courts of Justice, one of the four statues there?
I'm not sure. I was actually looking at that today. I could see some medieval figures, but I couldn't identify any of them. But I wouldn't be surprised. I know that there are other. It's like a semi-3D statue of him maybe on there with like a relief. But yeah, I can't remember. There's also one in New York State at a university. I think it's called King Alfred's University or something like that. And that also aroused controversy from an early sort of woke rebellion, like the iconoclasm of the BLM movement. Back in the I think it was in the noughties, like the first 10 years of this millennium, there were people complaining about it. My complaint about it would be that he's dressed in Roman attire, which is anachronistic. But theirs was that he was too straight, too white, and too male. So they were actually talking about pulling down the statue at a university named after him, more than 10 years before the BLM movement. So if people try and say all that stuff happened in 2020, they're quite wrong.
I just finally wanted to ask you about what role you think religion has played in the kind of building of England.
Well, from the perspective of Bede and Alfred, of course, it was essential because the Vikings were of similar stock to the Anglo-Saxons. Actually, the Anglo-Saxons came from the same kind of region of the world and used to worship the same gods. They'd stopped worshipping those gods, and for long enough that they seemed foreign, even though for the first 200 years the English history we were worshipping Woden and Thunor, who are Odin and Thor in the words of the Vikings. And Bede, of course, is defining the English as a Christian people and telling their history in that way. But in the process, he's explaining their pagan origins, and he has to do that because when they arrived, he needs to distinguish them from the previous inhabitants, the Britons, who were all Christian by that, pretty much all Christian by that stage. Maybe a tiny pocket of pagans in Devon or something like that, but almost all of the Britons had become Christian. And he is not writing a pro-British. In those days, Britain referred to the pre-English inhabitants of Britain rather than like now it means all of us. But he was not like promoting the Britons just because they're Christian. From his perspective, the English were the chosen, God's chosen to come to this land and become Christian at a later date. So we have defined ourselves as Christian in those two early parts, but also it was necessary to define ourselves in opposition to other the Christians who were already here. And to do that, we had to recognize that we were a pagan people initially, which is an important part of our history too, because that's the foundation. We still give our days of the week are named after the Anglo-Saxon gods. So Thursday and Friday is these are Wednesdays after Woden, Thursdays after Thunor, Friday after Freya. So this is a part of our history that's very important too. But also we have been Christian ever since that time, but we've also had a unique kind of Christianity, and also sort of we've been first to kind of have a secular, because of the horrors of this English Civil War and a desire to sort of prevent similar religious turmoil, we have arrived at a secular ideology that others have copied subsequently, which allows people to keep their religious life private, and it doesn't interfere with public life so much, which was quite an agreeable arrangement until people started abusing it. But, we are also the country that gave Darwin, and Charles Darwin wouldn't go to church with his wife, but he'd walk her to the front door, because this is a very English way. He'd take his wife to the church and then wait for her outside. And when he died, Charles Darwin buried here in Westminster. Well, he's got a tomb in Westminster Abbey. And Canon Thomas Rowsell, my namesake, a relative of mine, was involved in the funeral, one of the priests involved in the funeral, the state funeral. He was given in a Christian burial, despite the fact that he wasn't Christian. So we have this sort of contradictory kind of Christian identity, which is well over 150 years old, where we are a Christian nation, but also, if you're not really a Christian like Darwin, you still can have a Christian burial, and you can. We're also, a lot of us, not Christians, but that doesn't make us any less English if we're not Christian, because we're an ethnic group before we were Christians, and we remain that ethnic group even if we cease to be Christians.
So I just want to briefly ask you about this, the pagan influence in British history. I know it's a specialism of yours. I really don't know much about it.
Well, it's a special subject for me because I am actually a pagan, so I find this area of history especially interesting. But yeah, for at least 200 years, the English people were continuing the religion that they brought from northern Germany and southern Denmark, which was polytheistic, just like all the old religions of Europe. That means it had many gods, and the main god was called Woden, who was kind of like the king of the gods, like Zeus or Jupiter. And there are other smaller gods, just like in the Greek and Roman religions, that more people will be familiar with. They would have been honored in temples, just like Greek religion, but a different kind of temple, which have been found, identified in some archaeological sites, in, like, for example, Yevering in Northumbria. And within those temples, there would be idols. And unlike in the south of Europe, where they were made of stone, these idols would have been made from wood more commonly. And those idols would have been honored with offerings. Sometimes animals would have been sacrificed to them. Sometimes beer was given. It said Paulus Diaconus, the Lombard, who wrote a history of the Lombards, describes how Germanic people used to offer barrels of beer to Woden, the king of the gods. So we can be sure that the English love of beer has a religious origin, perhaps. And this goes quite a long way back. And after we ceased to be pagan officially, which begins in England with the conversion of kings, the general populace remains quite pagan even after that, with the extent that even in the 10th century, actually, we have learned monks, Christians, who have been Christians for hundreds of years, are still invoking Woden in magical charms. Oh. So if we know that a literate, Christian, educated monk is doing that in the 10th century, we can be certain that the rural peasants were doing all sorts of things that aren't necessarily recorded. In fact, there's a German lawyer, I forget his name, who traveling in rural England in the 18th century, who records that the peasantry were carrying around idols of who he calls Ceres, the Roman goddess of wheat, but and carrying them around the fields to try and make them fruitful. This is very unlikely to have been an idol of Ceres. It would have been an idol of an English goddess like Ercha, who we have from a 10th century Anglo-Saxon charm as a goddess who was invoked to make the fields fruitful. So I think that actually the pagan element in English culture sort of continued quite a lot, and I think that's part of the reason why even people who call themselves Christians or atheists sometimes have a sort of emotional relationship with the countryside. Yeah. It's such an important part of our identity. The trees and the plants and the animals are so special to English people because we have this memory of an earlier stage of our history.
Tom Rowsell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.